The faint, persistent hum of the gymnasium's ventilation system was a sound Eliza remembered from 2 decades ago, a sound that had underscored anxious exam silences and the boisterous energy of pep rallies. Tonight, it was the backdrop to a low-grade dread that coiled in her stomach. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple navy blue blazer, a garment chosen for its comfortable anonymity, and scanned the sea of faces. They were older, etched with the fine lines of mortgages, divorces, and promotions, but the essential social architecture remained terrifyingly intact. The same cliques clustered around the makeshift bar, their laughter echoing with the same confident, exclusionary tone she recalled with a visceral chill. Her name was Eliza, and returning to this place felt like willingly stepping into a ghost story where she was the primary haunting. She had resisted coming for months. The cream-colored invitation with its gaudy high school mascot felt like a summons from a past she had meticulously walled off. But her sister, Clara, had been insistent. "You need closure, Eli," she'd said over a crackling satellite phone connection weeks ago. "You can't spend your whole life running from a bunch of petty high school bullies. Go show them the woman you've become." The irony was that the woman she'd become was the one person she couldn't show them. Her life was a classified document, bound by oaths and sealed by necessity. Here, she wasn't General Harris, a figure who commanded respect in situation rooms and navigated geopolitical minefields. She was just Eliza, the quiet girl who sat at the back of the class, the one whose name was a convenient blank space on the social register. Her eyes landed on Jessica, who held court near the punch bowl. Her blonde hair was still immaculate, her dress a shimmering beacon of expensive taste. She hadn't changed, only amplified. Beside her, his arm draped possessively around her waist, was Mark. Her Mark. Or rather, the boy who had once been hers before he traded her thoughtful silences for Jessica's dazzling popularity. He had been the star quarterback, his future a golden promise everyone had bought into. Now he looked softer. The sharp angles of his youth had blurred into a comfortable paunch, but he still wore the same cocksure grin, the one that had once made her heart flutter and later made it break. A nervous energy rippled through the crowd as someone began a slideshow. Photos of awkward teenagers with braces and questionable fashion choices flashed onto a large screen, eliciting waves of laughter and groans. Eliza watched herself appear for a fleeting moment, a serious-looking girl with glasses and a book clutched to her chest, caught mid-blink. A ripple of polite, almost pitying chuckles went through the people nearby. She felt a hot flush creep up her neck. This was a mistake. She should never have come. Clara was wrong. Some doors were best left not just closed, but welded shut. She took a slow, deep breath, the way she'd been trained to do when the pressure mounted, when the stakes were infinitely higher than a little social discomfort. Center yourself. Observe your surroundings. Identify threats. Assess your exit strategy. The habit was so ingrained it was instinct. The threats here weren't armed insurgents. They were memories armed with ridicule. The exit was right behind the sad-looking DJ booth. Before she could execute her retreat, a voice cut through her thoughts, slick and painfully familiar. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Eliza, I almost didn't recognize you without a stack of textbooks." Mark stood before her, Jessica clinging to his arm like a designer accessory. His eyes did a quick, dismissive sweep of her plain slacks and sensible flats. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It was an evaluation, and she had already been found wanting. "Mark," she said, her voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "Jessica, you both look well." Jessica's smile was a masterpiece of condescending sweetness. "Oh, we are," she purred, patting Mark's chest. "Mark S. just been made regional manager at the dealership. We're looking at a house by the lake." She delivered the news like an announcement of a royal succession, her gaze fixed on Eliza, waiting for the inevitable reciprocal question about her own life, a question she clearly expected to have a disappointing answer. "That's wonderful," Eliza said, offering a small, tight-lipped smile. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of asking for details, nor would she offer any of her own. Her silence, she knew, would be interpreted as failure, and in this specific arena, she was willing to let them believe it. Mark leaned in, his breath a stale mix of beer and overconfidence. "So, what about you, Eli? Last I heard, you joined the army or something. See the world?" The question was casual, but the subtext was heavy. Did you ever amount to anything? Did you finally escape this town only to end up folding flag? Or filing papers in some forgotten government building. Eliza held his gaze. Something like that, she replied, the ambiguity deliberate. I work for the government. It involves a lot of travel. Jessica let out a little tinkling laugh. Oh, a government job. How stable. You must get great benefits. It was the kind of praise one offered a child for coloring within the lines, a verbal pat on the head for a life perceived as small and unremarkable. The old hurt, the ghost of the teenage girl who had loved Mark with a fierce and unshielded heart, whispered in her ear. It reminded her of the day he'd broken up with her in the school library, his voice a low murmur as he explained that he needed to be with someone on his level, someone who fit his future. He had gestured vaguely toward Jessica, who was laughing with her friends by the water fountain. Eliza had felt herself shrink, her world collapsing into the silent, unforgiving space between the bookshelves. Now, standing here, she felt that same phantom pressure, the weight of their judgment. But this time, something was different. Beneath the hurt was a bedrock of resilience, forged in fire and hardship they couldn't possibly imagine. She was no longer that fragile girl. She was the architect of a life they could never comprehend, and that knowledge was a silent, unyielding shield. The conversation, or rather, the interrogation, was mercifully cut short when another couple from their old circle approached, sweeping Mark and Jessica into a loud, backslapping embrace. Eliza used the moment to slip away, melting into the shadows at the edge of the gymnasium. She found a relatively quiet spot near a dusty trophy case, its glass preserving the relics of a time she'd fought hard to forget. There was Mark's football jersey, a photo of the championship team, his arm around a younger, more vulnerable version of herself, a version that had since been cropped out of the official photo that hung in the school's main hall. It was a petty cruelty she hadn't forgotten. She ran a finger over the cool glass, her reflection staring back, a woman in her late 30s, her face carrying a quiet intensity that was often mistaken for sadness. She thought about the last 20 years. While they were climbing the corporate ladder of a local car dealership and picking out curtains for a lake house, she had been learning to lead, to strategize, to make impossible decisions in places where a single mistake could be measured in lives. Her government job had taken her to dusty, war-torn landscapes, to sterile briefing rooms where the fate of nations was debated in hushed tones, and to the quiet, solemn ceremonies for fallen comrades. She had earned her rank not through charm or popularity, but through grit, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of duty that had become the core of her being. The profound disconnect between her reality and their perception was a chasm so vast it was almost absurd. To them, her simple clothes and quiet demeanor were signs of a life unlived. To her, they were the camouflage she wore to navigate the civilian world, a world that felt increasingly foreign. A gentle touch on her arm startled her. It was Sarah, a woman who had been a peripheral friend in high school, always kind but easily swayed by the gravitational pull of the popular crowd. Her face was etched with a genuine, if slightly pitying, concern. "Eliza, I can't believe it's really you. It's been forever. Are you okay? You look a little lost." The question was well-intentioned, but it grated on Eliza's nerves. "I'm fine, Sarah, just taking it all in. It's a lot." Sarah nodded sympathetically, her eyes flicking over to where Mark and Jessica were now the center of a large, laughing group. "I know. It's like nothing's changed, right? Mark's still the king of the castle and Jessica's still his queen. I saw them talking to you earlier. Don't let them get to you. They were always like that." "I'm not," Eliza said, the words feeling only partially true. Their words didn't wound her in the same way, but they did excavate a pain she thought she had buried. "So, what are you up to these days?" Sarah asked, her tone bright and conversational. "I'm a pediatric nurse over at the city hospital. 2 kids, a mortgage, the whole 9 yards. It's crazy, but good." "That sounds wonderful," Eliza replied, and she meant it. There was a nobility in Sarah's life, a grounding reality she sometimes craved. A life where the biggest crisis was a sick child or a missed bill, not a failing peace treaty or a compromised asset. "I heard you're in a government job," Sarah continued, lowering her voice slightly. "Anything exciting?" Eliza considered her answer. She could say she was a logistics coordinator or an analyst, plausible, boring, and utterly forgettable. It was her standard cover. "It's mostly paperwork," she said with a slight shrug. "Not very exciting, I'm afraid." Sarah gave her a reassuring squeeze on arm. "Well, hey, steady work is what matters, right? Not everyone can be a high flyer like Mark." The comment was meant to be comforting, but it landed like a stone, reinforcing the narrative everyone had already written for her. Eliza, the quiet, dependable, unremarkable one. The one who had peaked in the high school library and had been drifting ever since. The music shifted to a slow, nostalgic ballad from their senior year, and couples began to drift onto the dance floor. Sarah gave her an apologetic smile. "My husband is waving me over. It was so good to see you, Eliza. Really." And with that, she was gone, leaving Eliza alone with the ghosts in the trophy case once more. The night wore on, a slow-motion parade of forced smiles and hollow conversations. Eliza mostly listened, a silent observer on the fringes. She heard tales of stock portfolios, of children accepted into prestigious universities, of lavish vacations to exotic locales. Every conversation was a subtle competition, a relitigation of the high school hierarchy with adult stakes. She learned that Mark's regional manager position was at his father-in-law's dealership, a detail Jessica conveniently omitted. She learned that several of the popular kids had faced their own quiet struggles, failed businesses, messy divorces, battles with addiction. But here, tonight, they wore their success like armor, deflecting any hint of vulnerability. The air grew thick with the smell of cheap wine and desperation. It was the desperation to prove that the promise of their youth had not been a lie, that they were still the winners they had been crowned 2 decades ago. And to have winners, you needed losers. It was a social equation as old as time. Eliza, with her quiet presence and vague career, was the perfect candidate for the role. She became a focal point for their collective insecurity. The whispers followed her as she refilled her glass of water. "I heard she lives in a tiny apartment in the city. Someone said she never even got married. What a shame. She was so smart, too." The comments were like tiny needles, not painful enough to cause a real wound, but sharp enough to be a constant, irritating presence. She maintained her composure, her face a neutral mask. Inside, the strategist was at work. She analyzed their behavior not as personal attacks, but as tactical maneuvers. They weren't just being cruel, they were reinforcing their own positions by defining hers. By casting her as a failure, they could feel more secure in their own successes, however fragile they might be. The climax of this silent campaign came when Mark, emboldened by alcohol and the fawning attention of his audience, strode to the center of the room. He tapped a glass with a spoon, the sharp clinking sound cutting through the chatter. "Hey, everyone, can I have your attention?" he bellowed, his voice slurring slightly. A hush fell over the gym. "I was just thinking," he began, a smirk playing on his lips, "about how far we've all come. We've got doctors, lawyers, business owners in this room. We really lived up to the hype, didn't we?" A chorus of cheers and whoops answered him. His eyes scanned the room and with a theatrical flourish landed on Eliza. "And then I see my old friend Eliza over there," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "And it's a good reminder for all of us, a reminder to be humble, because not everyone gets to live the dream. Some people just live, and that's okay too." He raised his glass. "So let's have a toast to Eliza. For keeping it real and proving that you don't need a fancy title or a big house to show up to a reunion." The insult was so brazen, so publicly delivered, that it sucked the air out of the room for a moment before a wave of sycophantic laughter erupted. It wasn't just Mark's friends. It was nearly everyone, a collective release of social anxiety directed at a single, safe target. They laughed because it wasn't them. They laughed because it made them feel superior. They laughed because, for a moment, they could forget the cracks in their own perfect lives. Eliza stood frozen, the glass of water cold in her hand. This was worse than the library. This was a public execution of her perceived worth. Every eye was on her, waiting for a reaction. They wanted tears. They wanted her to flee in shame. They wanted the satisfaction of having broken her. Her training took over. Do not react. Do not escalate. Your emotional state is a weapon that can be used against you. She looked at Mark, at his flushed, triumphant face, and she felt a sudden, profound wave of nothing. Not anger, not hurt, but a vast, empty pity. He was still that boy in the hallway, the one who needed to push others down to feel tall. 20 years had passed, and he hadn't grown an inch. She simply held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if accepting his ridiculous toast. Her silence unnerved them. It wasn't the reaction they expected. The laughter faltered, dying out into an awkward and uncertain quiet. She had refused to play her part. It was in that tense, uncomfortable silence that the sound began. A low, rhythmic whump-whump-whump that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound utterly alien to the quiet suburban night. Heads turned. People exchanged confused glances. The DJ, thinking it was feedback, fiddled with his equipment, but the sound only grew louder, more insistent. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that vibrated through the soles of their feet, rattling the flimsy decorations taped to the basketball hoops. The windows of the gymnasium began to tremble, the cheap glass buzzing in its frames. The sound was no longer just auditory. It was a physical presence, a powerful, invisible force pressing in on the building. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy. Mark's smug expression dissolved into a frown of annoyance. "What the hell is that?" someone shouted over the din. People began to move toward the windows, their curiosity overriding the social drama of a moment ago. Outside, the darkness of the school's football field was obliterated by a blindingly bright light that swept across the grass, illuminating every blade in stark, unnatural detail. The source of the light and the deafening noise was now visible. A sleek, dark helicopter, its form menacing and powerful against the night sky. It wasn't passing over, it was descending, its landing gear extending as it prepared to touch down on the 50-yard line with practiced, military precision. The reunion was forgotten. The entire party was now pressed against the windows, their faces lit by the strobing effect of the rotor blades. Murmurs of disbelief and excitement rippled through the crowd. "Is that a news chopper? Maybe a medical emergency? No way, look at it, that's military." The sheer power on display was mesmerizing, a piece of a much larger, more serious world intruding upon their small festival of nostalgia. Just as the speculation reached a fever pitch, the gymnasium doors burst open, and two figures stepped inside. They were not former students. They were men dressed in dark, functional uniforms, their movements sharp and economical. They scanned the room with an intensity that made everyone feel scrutinized and insignificant. The taller of the two, an officer with silver oak leaves on his collar, had a face that was a mask of grim purpose. His eyes swept past the stunned faces of the alumni, past the gaping mouths of Mark and Jessica, and locked onto the one person in the room who was not looking out the window. His gaze found Eliza. With a discipline that was awe-inspiring, the officer strode directly toward her, his boots making sharp, authoritative sounds on the polished wooden floor. He moved through the crowd as if they were ghosts, his focus absolute. The party-goers instinctively parted, a path clearing for him as if by an invisible force. He stopped a respectful 3 feet in front of Eliza and executed a salute so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air. The gesture was so formal, so out of place in this setting of cheap decorations and fading memories, that it stunned the room into a complete and profound silence. The only sound was the thrumming of the helicopter outside. "General Harris," the officer said, his voice clear and resonant, easily carrying over the noise. "I apologize for the intrusion. Your transport is here. The situation in the sector has been escalated. We need to leave immediately, ma'am." The words detonated in the quiet gym. General Harris. Ma'am, each syllable landed with the force of a physical blow. The collective cognitive dissonance was palpable. This was Eliza. Quiet, mousy Eliza, the girl from the library. The one with the boring government job. The woman they had just toasted as a symbol of mediocrity. The name Harris was her father's, a name no one had used for her since she left town. But General? The title was impossible, a tear in the fabric of their shared reality. Time seemed to slow down. Eliza saw Mark's face, a comical mask of slack-jawed disbelief. The glass he was holding slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute stillness. Jessica's perfectly made-up face had gone pale, her lipstick a garish slash of color against her ashen skin. She looked from the uniformed officer to Eliza and back again, her brain visibly failing to compute the data it was receiving. All around the room, the expressions were the same. Shock, confusion, and the dawning, horrifying realization that they had made a monumental, unforgivable mistake. Eliza's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The quiet, unassuming woman they had been mocking was gone, replaced by someone else entirely. It was a transformation so complete it was chilling. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and an aura of command. settled over her as comfortably as her blazer. The years of training, of leadership under unimaginable pressure rose to the surface. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer their classmate. She was General Harris. She gave the officer a curt, professional nod. "Understood, Colonel. Brief me on the way." Her voice was different, too. It was the same voice, but it was imbued with an authority that left no room for argument, a tone that expected and received immediate obedience. She turned to leave, her movements efficient and purposeful. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't offer a parting shot or a triumphant speech. Her silence was her verdict. Her departure was their judgment. As she walked toward the open doors, the throng of her former classmates parted for her as if she were royalty, or perhaps something more intimidating. People avoided her eyes, their faces a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and a newfound fear. They were not looking at Eliza anymore. They were looking at a 4-star general, a person who inhabited a world of power and consequence they could not even begin to fathom. She paused for a single, fleeting moment as she passed Mark. He was still staring at the shattered glass at his feet, as if the pieces represented the complete implosion of his worldview. She looked at him, not with anger or contempt, but with a cool, detached pity. He was a relic, a man forever trapped in the glory of his 18th year, and in that moment he had never looked smaller. Her gaze then flicked to Jessica, who was clutching Mark's arm, her knuckles white, her face a mask of utter humiliation. The queen bee had been dethroned not by a rival, but by a reality so far beyond her comprehension that it had rendered her completely irrelevant. Eliza gave a final, brief glance to Sarah, who stood by the dance floor, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a look of profound regret for her own easy complicity in the group's judgment. Then, Eliza turned and walked out of the gymnasium and into the windy night, leaving behind the wreckage of their petty kingdom. The wind from the helicopter's rotors blasted into the gym, a tangible force that whipped napkins off tables and sent the cheap crepe paper streamers into a frenzy. It was the wind of her real life, and it was sweeping away the last vestiges of her past. The helicopter lifted off into the darkness, a roaring crescendo that quickly faded, leaving behind a silence in the gymnasium that was heavier and more profound than any before it. The party was over. No one spoke. The slideshow on the wall continued its cheerful, oblivious cycle, flashing images of a past that now felt like a lie. Mark stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance. His entire identity, built on the foundation of being the town's golden boy, the high school hero who had peaked early but still lorded it over everyone else, had been demolished. He had mocked a woman who commanded armies. He had offered his pity to someone who likely held national secrets. The sheer scale of his misjudgment was crushing. Jessica began to cry, not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet, hiccuping sounds of pure, undiluted shame. Her social standing, her entire sense of self-worth, was built on a fragile pyramid of perceived superiority. That pyramid had just been turned to dust. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was just the fool who had publicly ridiculed a general. The other guests began to quietly gather their things, avoiding eye contact with each other. The shared guilt was a toxic cloud in the air. They were all complicit, every single one who had laughed, or whispered, or even just stood by and said nothing. Their comfortable, predictable world had been irrevocably tilted on its axis. They had been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a look at a world of genuine power and consequence, and it had exposed their own lives, their own ambitions, their own reunion for what it was: small, petty, and ultimately meaningless. Inside the vibrating cabin of the Black Hawk, Eliza stared out the window, watching the lights of her hometown shrink until they were just a faint, anonymous cluster in the vast darkness below. The colonel handed her a tablet, its screen glowing with encrypted tactical data. "Ma'am, the situation has deteriorated. Insurgent forces have breached the perimeter at Sector Gamma. They're targeting the embassy." Eliza took the tablet, her mind already shifting, processing the information, formulating strategies. The trivialities of the reunion were fading like a distant dream. The faces of Mark and Jessica, the sound of their laughter, the sting of their insults, it all felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. There was a quiet satisfaction, a cold, clean sense of justice having been served. She had not sought revenge, but it had been delivered nonetheless in the most absolute and undeniable way possible. Yet there was no triumphant joy, no celebratory fist pump. The vict. Ori felt hollow. It was empowering, yes, to know that she had so thoroughly outgrown the small world that had once defined and confined her. But it was also profoundly lonely. She had returned seeking some form of closure, a way to reconcile the girl she was with the woman she had become. Instead, the night had only served to highlight the unbridgeable chasm between her two lives. She could command a battalion, but she couldn't sit in a high school gym for 2 hours without becoming a target. She could negotiate with world leaders, but she couldn't make small talk with the boy who had been her first love. She had chosen a path of immense sacrifice, personal relationships, a normal life, the simple comfort of being known and understood for who she really was. Tonight, she had shown them a sliver of her power, but they would never understand the cost. Looking down at the receding lights, Eliza felt the bittersweet weight of her own life. She had won. She had proven them all wrong. But as the helicopter banked hard and accelerated toward a crisis half a world away, she knew she was flying away not just from her past, but from a part of herself she could never reclaim. The real battle, she thought as she began to issue her first commands, was not the one she was flying toward, but the one that was always fought in the quiet, lonely spaces in between.